you. We have 5 presenters today, and we're going to be dividing it into 4 sessions. The first session will be Chris Caston from Bartson Roslin Caston. Chris Caston is also an ILAC co-chairman, and he'll be giving us the role of ILAC and how they have helped the homeowners and also commercial sponsors and managers in this quest for the new legislation, SB 40. Then we will hear from Jim Sloalkowski and Marshall Dickler from Dickler, Sloalkowski and Zavell Law Firm. They will be giving us the actual legal aspect of SB 40, what it means for associations, how associations need to comply, and they will provide us with that information. From there, we'll go to Adam Sanders from Elara Engineering, who will give us the technical aspect of the electrical charging stations and the background and history of how that all got started. And we will also then hear from Jory Carrick from Williamson Management, president of Williamson Management, who will give you the practical application of what has to happen for associations and what needs on the management side, how that will work with the associations in conjunction with installing the charging stations as we move forward. Mary Ellen Donovan will be breaking in with the questions, the Q&A, and as the questions come in, it'll be interactive, and so you'll be hearing from her. We'll start out with each panelist giving us their bio and then starting the presentation. We'll start off with Chris Caston, co-chairman of ILAC.
Thanks, Diane, and thank you to the Homeowner Education Committee for giving me the opportunity to participate in this presentation today. As Diane said, my name is Chris Caston, and I am an attorney and a principal at Bartson Roslin Caston. And our firm focuses on representing community associations, which we're all familiar with, in our condos, our HOAs, and our housing cooperatives. So we work on all different facets of issues that our association clients face. And as Diane mentioned, I am co-chair of the Illinois Legislative Action Committee. I'm also active in CAI's magazine committee as well, but I will be talking a little bit later about the Illinois Legislative Action Committee, or ILAC as we say for short, and what we do. Thanks, Dan.
All right, from the next person, we'll be hearing from Jim Sloalkowski of Dickler, Sloalkowski and Zavell.
Thank you, Diane. Good evening, everyone. It's great to be here. As Diane said, I'm Jim Sloalkowski from Dickler, Sloalkowski and Zavell. I've been a practicing attorney since 1988, and I have been focusing my practice on condominium and community association law since 1991. And it was, in fact, May of 91 when I started working with Marshall Dickler. Our firm does some other work. We do corporate work and personal injury as well. I myself focus on community association law. Over the years, I've done many presentations. I've done a number of articles, and I can say over 32 years in this community association world, it's been a fun ride, and it continues to be fun. So happy to talk about more of that tonight.
Thank you, Jim. And now we'll hear from Marshall Dickler, principal at Dickler, Sloalkowski and Zavell.
Hi, I'm Marshall Dickler. And I don't know that I have anything to add from what Jim has said. Very frankly, I'm the senior partner of the firm. I have been doing condominium and homeowners association work since 1976. Sounds like a long time, and it is a long time if you count up the years. And as Jim said, it's been a fun ride. Everybody thought it was a very easy area of law. It is not a very easy area of law. It combines real estate, corporate law, among other things. It involves just a huge amount of different areas of law. It involves some federal law, constitutional law, it covers the full gamut of areas of law, more than most other areas that one could think about. And we've had to deal with all of those areas of law. I'm also a member of the ILAC committee. Actually, I'm an emeritus member of the ILAC committee. They kind of put me out to pasture, but I participate in all the meetings because I was on the committee for 10 years. And so now I have to be an emeritus member for another year or two until I qualify to come back on the committee. We do a great deal of work both locally in the state of Illinois and nationally at the federal level. And it's important work. If you understand that we're doing work with the state legislature and we're doing work with the federal legislature, then you understand that it is complex, it isn't simple, it isn't easy, and we serve as attorneys an important role in helping to direct, advise, assist with problems and issues in condominium and homeowners associations. And it's been just as Jim said, a great ride. It's been a great learning experience. Jim and I have volumes of experience, but every once in a while, we have a new one that comes up. And actually, this was kind of a new one. I would also like to say, so Adam understands that I may interrupt him as I've done before, that prior to going to law school, I was a practicing electrical engineer at Motorola. And so this particular area, and I have been involved with automobiles and the automobile industry for many, many years. In fact, everybody expected me to own a repair shop. No one expected me to go to college, let alone law school. So I know a lot about cars. I know a lot about electrical equipment. I also have a connection up in California, and I've had early active connection with this issue in a condominium in Los Angeles where my daughter resides. And she's the president of a condo, and we weekly have long discussions about the issues that she has in a condominium association, including electric charging stations. So with that, we turn it over to whoever's next.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Marshall. We'll introduce Adam Sanders from ILAC Engineering, and he will tell us about himself. Thank you, Adam.
Yeah, I'm Adam Sanders with ILAC Engineering. We've been an engineering firm since the late 90s. We do various types of engineering from new construction to large renovation to schools, but we also have a cornerstone of our company has been condominium buildings, specifically high rises downtown, but we also do apartments and condo buildings out in the suburbs area, more of a low rise type of application. So we're pretty experienced with working with condominium buildings and being able to navigate that field. In the last couple of years, we have seen a large influx of electric vehicle type projects, in particular electric vehicle studies. So typically we have clients asking us to perform some studies to see what's possible, and I'll talk about that a little bit later, but also some implementations at this point. So we'll talk about that a little bit later, but we have an entire electrical division in our company that's been working on these now for the last couple of years, and we've learned some lessons out of it, and we've learned that each building is unique. So yeah, we are quite experienced at this point.
Thank you, Adam. And our final panelist, Jory Carrick, President and Manager of Williamson Management. Jory.
Hi, everyone. Thank you. My name is Jory Carrick. I'm the President of Williamson Management. As Diana just alluded to, we've been in business since the early 80s. I've owned the company since 1998. With respect to our company, we're a full service property management company specializing in condominiums, townhomes, and homeowners associations. The issues that we'll be facing today on this panel is something that's going to be new to us, but it's not new in terms of the project process in and of itself. All this really is another project that's going to be in the face of our clients and deciding what do we have to do, how do we get there, what's funding going to look like, what's the scope and level of service that's going to be needed, what type of construction projects are going to be needed, what type of contractors are going to be needed, et cetera, et cetera. Obviously, all that will be mixed in with municipality requirements. And the overall, the ease or difficulty of installing this equipment that will is somewhat mandatory. So our role is simply to be the administrative spine to our clients and help with the project management to make sure that the end result is achieved as desired and within budget.
Thank you, Jory. We're about ready to start, so you can see participants that we have a valued panel here, very informative. We're going to learn a lot. And remember, use the Q&A, and any questions that are not answered during the session will be answered at the end. Again, the Q&A, Mary Ellen Donovan will be interspersing with questions. And so we start now with Chris. Thank you. It's all yours.
Thanks again, Diane. All right, everybody. I am here to tell you a little bit about what ILAC is and give some historical background about how ILAC was involved with the Electric Vehicle Charging Station Act, which is what the presentation is focusing on today, which is currently public. Well, it was enacted as Public Act 103-0053. So that's the Public Act number. It was introduced at Senate Bill 40. So you may hear people talk about SB 40 or Senate Bill 40. That's what we're talking about. This Electric Vehicle Charging Act. What is ILAC? So briefly, ILAC is the state arm of the National Legislative Action Committee. So CAI National has a LAC, and in almost every state, it has a state arm of the LAC. The national LAC works at the national level, and each state LAC works at the state level. So Illinois' Legislative Action Committee, ILAC, we are a group of volunteers from a diverse range of our industry. So our members consist of people from the insurance industry, banking, law, management, and we even have homeowners on our committee. So that means that we're a diverse group, and we have a diverse array of opinions and insight. So that is what becomes useful when we see a piece of legislation come across our desk, so to speak, and what we do when we look at it. ILAC doesn't just look at legislation, but we work to build relationships. We have a lobbyist, Jeff Dixon, who's our lobbyist and has been our lobbyist for many years now. He's a wonderful lobbyist and is well known in Springfield, and without him, we could not be as effective as we are. So we, as a group, build relationships, and we do that by meeting with legislators personally, virtually, going to their events, fundraising events, or as a group going down to Springfield and meeting with various legislators throughout the particular day to talk about our issues, our industry issues and concerns, and building relationships, which is necessary because that helps us do what we did with respect to SB 40, the electric vehicle charging station. We not only review bills that have been introduced that impact our industry and monitor them to see what happens, but when there is a bill that could be particularly useful or helpful or particularly damaging to our industry, we'll get even more involved. And that's when we reach out to the bill sponsor, which is the legislator, and try and have a sit down with them and talk to them and explain to them and educate them about our industry and about our concerns and why the particular bill they introduced is bad or good. So that's briefly what ILAC does. And what ILAC did with respect to the electric vehicle charging station or charging act is a good illustration of what we do and how we can be effective in Springfield. SB 40 was introduced in January of this year, if I remember correctly. And it's basically an iteration of a bill that has been introduced in the legislature for the past 3 years or so. And part of our ILAC's most successful work in dealing with SB 40 is when we looked at it, we identified a whole bunch of issues. And one is that it had this term renovated, and it applied to existing associations when they decided to do work which fell within the definition of the word term renovated within that statute, and it could trigger some requirements for that association to meet with respect to electric vehicle charging when they were doing something else. So the example often was given, the association was embarking in a elevator upgrade or modernization project, which is a very expensive project to begin with. And that could involve the electric system, electric panel, which under the bill as it was introduced could have triggered some obligations for the association, and the association had to expand the scope of that project so that it not only did work to do the elevator modernization, but also did work to make the association EV capable or EV ready, even though nobody's asked for, or was looking for electric charging station to be installed. And so we explained to the sponsor and the stakeholders how that could have a significant financial detriment to an association. It could impact their ability to do projects that are needed and may create push off projects and create more deferred maintenance. And so in talking with the sponsors and meeting with them, we met with them down in Springfield. We had multiple conversations with them over the telephone, and they understood the adverse impact it would have on our associations. And that whole section was removed from SB 40. So the Electric Vehicle Charging Act that we see today and we'll be talking about today doesn't have this renovated section. So that was a great success of ILAC, is to get that out. So it only applies to all those requirements for EV charging stations, EV ready and EV capable, all apply to new construction. The other thing that ILAC did is Section 30 of the Act talks about a unit owner's right to install electric vehicle charging station, and ILAC was involved in getting changes to that to make sure that it accounted for how association properties exist, both condominiums and non-condominiums, and to try to make the terms a little bit more fair and try to make the terms impose or put certain obligations, financial obligations and insurance obligations on the unit owner who's installing the electric vehicle charging station, because that charging station is essentially their personal property and for their personal use. Because we're not talking about the association installing one for owners to use, but an individual owner purchased an electric vehicle and needs to install a charging station or wants to install a charging station. So we work with the sponsor and the stakeholders to make certain changes to Section 30 to make them as fair and accurate as possible, as we could within, we didn't get everything we wanted all the time, but we worked with them and they worked with us. One of the things that we were able to do is we were able to change the legal fee, the fee shifting provision. So it originally stated that the prevailing plaintiff could recover its attorney's fees in a lawsuit that involves that particular section of the act, but we were successful in getting a change to prevailing party. So that means that, both sides, it's a two-way street with respect to fee shifting. So that was another success. So that's why this particular bill, not only is it important for us to talk about because it's going to impact associations going forward, but from a CAI perspective, it was a bill that we were, through ILAC, was very much involved in shaping to what we see today and what we will be talking about today. So with that, I will turn it over to our next panelist to talk more. But if anyone has questions, about what ILAC is, what we do, you can ask them now. Feel free to contact the Illinois chapter office and we can get in contact and we can provide that additional information. And if there's any other questions regarding ILAC's involvement in SB 40, which is now the Electric Vehicle Charging Act, feel free to ask and I'm here to answer those questions. But with that, Diane, I turn it back over to you all.
Thank you, Chris. I think people have now realized what ILAC stands for and the value that this committee provides to the condo industry. We thank you for that opener. And now we'll turn over to our second session, our second presenters, Marshall and Marshall Dickler and Jim Sloalkowski.
Thank you, Diane. Let me share my screen real quick. Okay. Good evening again, everyone. This portion of the presentation is to discuss the actual new law and how it applies or will apply. It was passed this year. It was signed by the governor in June. It's effective the 1st of next year. And we'll talk in a second about how it applies. As Chris said, hold on, my slide, there we go. As Chris said, we have generally referred it to SB 40. It's now a public act, it's public law. And here's probably a really important thing that everyone wants to know or needs to know. The applicability, according to section 10 of the statute, which is now called the Electric Vehicle Charging Act, this statute will only apply to newly constructed residences, single-family homes and multi-unit residential buildings that have parking spaces and are constructed after the effective date of the act, which is January 1st. Very important to know. I think Jory alluded to it in his earlier introduction as to how associations are going to deal with it. Right now, existing associations do not have to comply with this. Don't be surprised if in the future things start changing and there are laws that are applied to existing associations dealing with electric charging stations. But right now, this is only going to apply to new construction. So you may have a sigh of relief, but if you're a property manager, there's going to be a day you're going to represent a new association constructed after the 1st of next year. And this is going to apply. But also in terms of existing associations, and I'll get to this later in our presentation, I think it gives a guide to some extent to associations who may not be required to comply with the statute, but want to voluntarily allow in certain situations charging stations to be installed. And this maybe gives a guide as to what would be some good restrictions or conditions to put on owners. The new law is going to apply to condo conversions. So to the extent there's existing apartment buildings that are multifamily, the developer is going to have to comply with the requirements of putting in EV ready parking spaces, or EV capable, I should say, unless it's a severe financial hardship or it's going to require them to pull up parking lots and whatnot to put in huge infrastructure. So it may apply to existing properties who convert to a condo. I didn't put them in the slide here. There's a couple definitions that may be worthwhile at least pointing out now. They're kind of technical, so it's not my intent to get into that technical aspect of it. But there are a couple things in particular. There's a definition for electric vehicle charging system, which is basically the device that'll be used to charge a vehicle. There is a term called EV capable. And here on the top of this slide, you'll see EV capable parking space. An EV capable means parking spaces that have the electrical panel capacity and conduit installed during construction to support future implementation of electric vehicle charging with 240 volt, 208 volt or 240 volt or greater, 40 amps or greater circuits. Then there's another definition that Chris mentioned earlier. There's a term called EV ready, which has a long definition. But essentially, as I understand it, that's where it's ready to just connect. The panels probably, I think that means the panel's already been put in. So the new law is going to require for a new construction that new single family residences, single family or small multifamily residence, 2 to 4 families. And yes, it uses that term in the statute. It doesn't say 2 to 4 units. It says 2 to 4 families, which probably means units. Shall have at least one EV capable parking space for each residential unit that has dedicated parking. Unless later codes adopted require more. So any unit that's going to have a dedicated parking space for these small buildings is going to require construction of an EV capable parking space, meaning it's going to be ready for installation of the charging system. With respect to the larger buildings, which are 5 or more families in one building, or large multifamily residential buildings that are being converted, they're going to be required to have 100% of the total parking spaces EV capable. Note that this doesn't say every unit is entitled to a parking space. That's not always the case and often not the case. But to the extent there is parking, and most municipalities will require parking, every one of the spaces are going to have to be EV capable. Here's section 30, which Chris mentioned earlier. This is the important thing for us, and particularly subsection A. Section 30 is what's called the policy for unit owners. So it's intended to really apply to community associations, condo and homeowner association. And what it says is that any covenant, restriction, or condition, and any provision of governing document that effectively prohibits or unreasonably restricts the installation or use of an electric vehicle charging system within an owner's unit or a designated parking space, including deeded parking spaces and parking spaces in an owner's exclusive use common area, which we normally call limited common elements, or any parking space that's designated for use by a particular owner. Could just be general common element parking or common area parking where the association gets to assign it or designate it to a unit. You cannot have any conditions or restrictions that prohibit it or effectively unreasonably restrict it. What does that mean? It could be many different things. What's an unreasonable restriction? Let's say you try to impose a requirement that to put in an electric charging station in your unit or your parking space that you're otherwise entitled to, and you're going to say you have to give us a $10,000 deposit before we'll let you put it in. That's probably an unreasonable restriction because it effectively prevents them from putting it in. But this is the real enacting clause that's going to prohibit associations from restricting installation of the charging systems. Again, this doesn't apply to existing properties. So to the extent there are provisions in governing documents that prohibit or restrict it, those will still apply. It's unlikely, and I know I've never seen one that specifically says you can't put in an electric vehicle charging system because it's a relatively new topic. But where restrictions come in typically are the alteration and modification provisions where someone can't alter or prohibit or modify the common area. Sometimes even the units you'll see in declarations. That's where those provisions will come into play. Someone in an existing property has no right to alter the common elements unless the board is going to allow it. So those things will still apply. It does not apply to.
I have one question here.
Sure.
The question is, if units have garages for each unit and there's power available in the panel in the garage, does that count as the space? Or is there a requirement for an additional space outside the garage?
I'm not sure I understand the question to the extent it's talking about spaces. Because if we're talking about newly constructed, every space is going to be constructed with that already, so it's capable, EV capable. But to the extent it's talking about garages specifically, I'm going to get to that in a second because there's an interesting twist to that. Section 30 goes on in B that says any charging station installed by an owner pursuant to the statute becomes the property of the unit owner and shall not be deemed part of the common elements or common area. Chris referenced this earlier. That's just another piece of the puzzle that makes the owner installing it responsible for it. Subsection C requires that any charging system otherwise meets all health and safety standards. In other words, it still has to comply with all codes of the city or municipality, wherever you're located, or to the extent the state has something.
Good, Jim.
There's a
In that
yes.
same section, Jim, an additional question is, as any example of a reasonable requirement, for example, are the costs of this kind of modification generally borne by the limited common owner? The
All
LCE.
things. Sorry, Mary Ellen, I didn't mean to interrupt. Good questions, and we're going to get to those. People are thinking ahead. I'm going in order the way the statute's written. And the next subsection is subsection D, which applies to applications for approval. The association, of course, can require people to make application to the board to install it. This provision says the board has to treat it just like they do any other request for an alteration or modification. If you have a policy, you have to follow your policy. You can't make stricter or more stringent application procedures. So again, if you don't charge an application fee, and most don't, you can't do that just for charging systems. It has to be the same policy. This provision also says, however, that the association shall not unreasonably delay approval or denial. You have to provide the owner, the requester, an answer in writing, and it has to be 60 days, no later than 60 days from the date you received the request. So there's an important time deadline, so you don't drag out someone's request. Here's where things start to get a little interesting. And anytime there's new law, us lawyers look at it and we see things and we go, what were they thinking when they did this? And no matter how hard ILAC tries to get things done in Springfield in a clear fashion, there's always going to be something that leaves us scratching our head. And sometimes we just have to wait and see how things play out when the law is implemented. Subsection C says, and I subtitled this common elements and common area. If the electric vehicle charging system is to be placed in common area or exclusive use common area as designated by the association, then the following will apply. The reason I say this is interesting is because this only applies to common area, common elements, limited common elements. These things do not apply to a unit. In fact, you won't see anything in here like this that specifically applies to a unit. And to me, that kind of changes things. And again, we're talking about new construction from this perspective as to, does that mean you cannot regulate the installation of an EV charging system in someone's unit, which could be a parking space? There are a lot of buildings in Chicago for sure, where the parking spaces themselves are units. But really where I see the unit question coming in is condominium townhomes where people have their own garage. Those are generally part of the unit. They may be limited common elements, but a lot of times the townhome itself is a unit. So these things wouldn't apply to someone installing a charging station within their garage unit, if the garage is a unit. Earlier in the statute, and I may not have included it, if I did, I may have passed it. There is a statement that says, no, it was subsection B. I'll go back to it. First sentence, this section does not apply to provisions that impose a reasonable restriction on electric vehicle charging system. So what I'm saying is that those garage units, the association still has some authority based on this, I think, to impose reasonable restrictions on installing the system. I don't think you can prohibit the system, but I think there are some reasonable restrictions that can be imposed. And as a guide, as we proceed talking about the statute, I think you'll see things that will lead us to believe those would be some reasonable conditions or restrictions, even in people's garages. By way of analogy, to make it easier, a lot of associations have no provisions that govern people doing work, remodeling work inside their residential unit. And that's essentially what would be happening here, is they're doing remodeling work in their garage unit. And so normally you're not regulating that. And I think that's one of the reasons units aren't specifically addressed here. But what the legislature did is put in these requirements if there's going to be EV charging station installed into parking spaces that are LCEs or common elements. The first thing is the owner is required to get written approval from the association before they can put it in. And that, of course, there's probably going to be an application process, and the board has to give an answer within 60 days. The owner must agree to the following things: that they'll agree with any architectural standards or other reasonable conditions and restrictions for the installation of the EV system. Given that it's a technical, and Adam's going to talk about the technical aspects, it's not clear yet what architectural conditions or restrictions may be. Maybe it has to do, what are other conditions we impose for things on outside? Maybe there's color restrictions that may be reasonable. I think anything that's going to significantly increase the cost of installation or use is probably not reasonable, the satellite dish standard. But otherwise, owners have to comply with architectural standards. The owner has to agree to hire a licensed and insured electrical contractor to install it. No one's doing it themselves here. They're not having someone who claims to be amateur electrician do it. The owner has to agree that the contractor has liability insurance and will name the association, its officers, directors, and agents, the managing agents, as additional insureds, and shall provide a certificate of insurance indicating or showing that they've put that in place. The statute will require owners that within 14 days after approval, the owner has to provide a certificate of insurance of the owner's own insurance policy, liability insurance, naming the association officers, directors, and agents as additional insureds under the homeowners, the unit owners policy. The owner is obligated to pay for all the costs associated with installation, as well as electricity usage associated with that. And I'll get to that in a few minutes as well. The owner is responsible for any damage that's caused to the common elements or common areas or other units that result from the installation, use, or removal of the system.
Jim, I think we have maybe a chicken or an egg question.
Sure.
And you can tell me if it ought to tap over to Adam's segment. As far as the panel size is concerned, is there anything about limiting the size of the charger based on the panel size? So it's, is the association responsible to provide a certain panel size that will accommodate these changes? Or can the association limit based on the size of the panel? So it's a little bit of a circular question. Can you limit the size of the charger based on the panel size, for example?
A technical question on the technical side, I don't know that I'm able to answer that. However, from what's a reasonable restriction or condition, and I say, I don't know the technical side. I don't know what the sizes are or the practicalities of it. However, I do think it would be reasonable if we're talking about a parking space that's near other parking spaces, or depending on how the parking lot is configured or where the space is configured. I don't think it could interfere with or intrude on someone else's space. Now, keep in mind, newly constructed properties are going to take all of that into account, I have to assume, so that those things may not come up. But I think that it could be a reasonable restriction on, say, size, depending on the configuration of the particular space or parking lot, so that you're not blocking access to something. It would have to have a reasonable and a rational basis to limit that.
No, thank you. So then we'll pick that up with Adam later on. Yeah, thank you.
The simple answer is you can put a restriction in that qualifies and limits it based upon the amount of electrical capacity you have either in the panel or in the building. And if you don't have capacity, you can't provide them with that because that would create a dangerous electrical condition. And they can't put it in. It's almost that simple. And I would also want to throw in at this point in time that Jim and I, like most attorneys, even though we're in the same firm, we have differences of opinion on the applicability at times of some of these provisions. And I think that section 30A and all of the subsections apply to all condominiums today by the nature of the wording and the plan that they have set forth in them, whether it's today or not. I will tell you, I think that trying to apply it to existing condominiums is in my opinion, unconstitutional. And that deals with section A. Section A would not meet state or federal constitutional requirements. They are interfering with existing contracts. That's why they made it, which is the declaration is a contract, basically. And you can't interfere with existing contracts. You can only deal with future. So Jim's statement is technically accurate, but if you ask me whether it's going to pass muster in a court of law, my answer is the judges aren't going to say that. They're going to say, have you sued to declare it unconstitutional? And if we haven't done that, if we hadn't added that as a part of our complaint, which by the way is $250,000 to $500,000 expenditure to take it all the way up, the trial court probably will not declare it unconstitutional, and you're going to have to go all the way up. If they do, then we win at the first level. But the other side may appeal and the appellate court may change. So what Jim is saying is accurate, but I'm telling you, next year or the year after, they're going to slip in and remove that from, or add that this section applies to all condominiums. And we're not going to be able to stop the legislature from doing that at that point in time. So rather than fight that, establish all the rules and regulations pursuant to A, B, C, D, all the sections, and follow them and use not just an electrical engineer, not just a electrical contractor, licensed and certified, but you've got to get a stamped approved drawing and from the engineer that has to certify that the service is adequate and the power is adequate. And for all practical purposes, that's what Adam's going to talk about later. And that's his job. So I would say put in a rule that also require you to hire an electrical engineering company to certify the building and the limits of what can be added. So you know how many, if any, can be added. We have tons of buildings in the city all along Lakeshore Drive. I've just been talking with one about it. And I know they have 100 ampere services into the building, and their transformers are the same ones that they had in 1950 when the building was built. And they can't put in even washer and dryers in the unit, and they can't use hair dryers most of the time to dry their hair because it'll pop the circuits in those buildings. And yes, some of them had retrofitted and gone up to 200, but it's a very expensive proposition, and most haven't. They recognize that they have limitations. They have enough power to power their air conditioning systems, which are controlled in the building, but individual units have 100 ampere services to this date. And they would have to tap into it, as Adam will explain later, and tapping into it to run any one of these power stations for charging the cars will be, they'll be unable to do it if it's 100 ampere service per unit.
Marshall likes to talk about the Constitution, and we do have these debates all the time. And I do disagree. I do think it's only applicable to newly constructed for two reasons. One, Section 10, which is the applicability provision, says this act applies to newly constructed single-family homes and multifamily residential buildings. Section 30, which is what we've been talking about, these things that owners would have to agree to. Section 30 is part of this this act, and therefore it doesn't apply. Secondly, in the Section 5, which is legislative intent, which you'll often see in new laws now, which expresses the reason for the passage of the new law. Part of what it says is, when you get farther down, it says, therefore, a significant portion of parking spaces in new and renovated residential developments shall be capable of electric vehicle charging. But as I said earlier, I think these things we're talking about in Section a B, such as insurance and use of electrical contractors, I think they're a good guide to existing associations who may not be obligated to allow the systems put in, but to the extent they want to, I think it provides a pretty good guide of what's reasonable to do that. The last part of what owners have to agree to, the statute says that these things apply not just to the owner installing the charging system, but to the extent they're not removing it when they sell and transfer the property to someone else. The successive unit owner is also responsible for all costs of damage, either to the system or common elements or units. They're responsible for all costs, maintenance, repair, replacement of the system, and removal. They're responsible to cost of electricity. They must, the owner who sells the unit must disclose it to the purchaser of the unit that there's a charging system. So that owner knows they're going to inherit these responsibilities. And successive owners are required to maintain liability insurance. One of the requirements I mentioned that owners are responsible for is the cost of electricity. The statute says that's done either two ways. One, there may just be a meter, sub-meter put in with the system so that they get their own electric bill. To the extent that's not done, the statute says the association can reasonably estimate the cost of electricity used by the person installing the system. And you have to take into account, according to the statute, you're going to need information about the vehicle, such as how much electricity it's anticipated it will use, so that you can come up with a fairly reasonable and as certain as you can estimate of what to charge that particular person for their charging station.
You're always going to be looking for fights with that, and I'd say, as part of the rules, tell them that they have to put in their own meter, sub-meter. I think that's reasonable under the circumstances, because figuring this out is going to be difficult for most people. I mean, Adam could do it, I could probably do it, but anybody else, they're going to never be able to do it, very frankly. And Adam and I don't want to do it.
Yeah, Jim, can I selfishly ask the question to Jim real quick?
Sure.
Does it dictate anything about calculating that electrical usage other than reasonableness?
Well, I'll read it to you. Here's what it says. If not a meter, or a reasonable calculation of cost based on the average miles driven, efficiency of the electric vehicle calculated by the United States EPA, and the cost of electricity for the common area. So
Okay. Yeah, no, that's better than nothing essentially. So it's actually
Yes.
giving us a basis of a relative direction of how to calculate it. So thank you.
Yeah, the interesting part of that, I think it's based on average miles driven. It's an electric vehicle. I don't know why it says average miles. To me, wouldn't it be the miles driven?
Also, that's a bit subjective. Yeah, I drive more than somebody else might drive. So what exactly is the average miles driven? But yes.
Yeah, exactly.
They're gonna have to give a report. They're gonna have to tell them how many miles they've driven and, over a period of time, every month. And they're gonna have the unit owner is gonna have to give the association an opportunity to go check and make sure that that's accurate. Then you have to worry about whether somebody's gonna drive it in reverse for any period of time.
Hey, Jim, can I interject with some support, some historical background of SB 40 that supports actually something you said?
Please do.
You were mentioning on that subsection E, how it only applies to common areas. But it lists all this stuff that owners have to agree to. And there's nothing with respect to units. And so you pointed back to C, and where it says that, there can be reasonable restrictions put in place. Well, ILAC noticed that also. And so we raised that issue to the stakeholders, the sponsor, and we tried to have language added to SB 40 that would clarify that associations can use everything set forth in subsection E to basically anyone that wants to install. And the response we got is, no, we don't want to add more language because section C already says that reasonable restrictions are allowable. So that goes when ILAC approached these stakeholders about the issue you pointed out, we got the response that you pointed out that C already still says that. So based on my conversations about SB 40, I would agree with what you're talking about with associations. If they want to, they can use subsection E as a guide for putting in place reasonable restrictions for owners and how they install EV charging stations in their units.
Thanks, Chris. Perfect example of when I said, no matter how hard ILAC may try, we can't always get the people in Springfield to write things in the way they should be. Subsection G of section 30 has to do with just common area generally. This is what will give associations the authority to install its own charging system in the common area for use by everyone. And it says the association shall develop appropriate terms of use for using the system. In other words, policies or rules as to how the common charging system will be used. Things like time, are there certain hours of the day it could be used, time limits on how long someone can use it, something about costs, there's going to have to be a fee or cost or something. But they're leaving it in the hands to the associations to sort that out. That's kind of the sum and substance of the law, and as it applies going forward. I thought based on that, maybe we discuss where there are existing associations who are interested in allowing installation. I know and probably Chris, we've had clients that have already allowed some people to do it in their parking spaces or in garages. And as Marshall was talking about, and Adam will talk about, a lot of that has to do with the current infrastructure and what can it handle and what can't it handle? Is it feasible or not? To the extent an association is going to allow it in, say, a limited common element parking space or a dedicated outside space, I'd highly recommend there be a written agreement with the owner. Following the guides we had, I think you should require the owner to first submit with their request a proposal, a detailed proposal specifying where they're going to put their system, what they're going to use, how they're going to install it, who their contractor electrician is going to be, require that they have a licensed and insured electrician, require the electrician to have insurance, and add the association and management and everyone as additional insureds. Make sure the owner signs off that they're responsible for all costs. whether it's installation or use, and even removal down the road. That the owners agreeing to be responsible to maintain, repair, replace it, that the owner notifies their purchasers if they sell, that the owner has their own liability insurance and names the association, the board, the management as additional insureds. As long as it's permissive use and not allowed pursuant to the act. If you're doing a written agreement with an owner now at an existing place, I would recommend, but please speak to your own attorneys, that the agreement also state they'll be liable for damage, but also that they'll indemnify the association for any injury or loss. I don't know that you can get away with that now for under the statute for the new properties, probably not. I think that's the reason for the insurance provisions. But we do this all the time right now for exterior modifications and alterations. So I think that would be a good idea. So looking back on the statute, I think it provides some guide on a current basis on what's allowed. In terms of allowing it in the common area, we kind of talked about that. If you're going to install a, and I think Jory will probably touch on this. If you're going to allow a common use, you're going to install one for everyone's use. To me, these are some practical things that the board wants to think about. Obviously, you're going to use a licensed electrician to put it in. A practical location. You don't want to put it where it's going to interfere with driveways or in and out of the parking lots, or it's going to block use of something. You're going to need to have the space and a location to put it, and for people to obviously park their cars when they're charging up. Then you're going to want to have policies, procedures, or rules. Who can use? When can they use? Do they need appointments? Time limitations, how the cost's going to be allocated, things like that. These are all things boards are going to have to think about for common use chargers, whether it's newly constructed down the road or it's existing associations. With that, I'm open to any other questions. I don't know, Mary Ellen, if there was a question I said I'd get to that I didn't.
By saying, if I can, yes, I agree with everything you said and everything that Chris said. But you're going to have people out there that either through their contractors or their brokers or the persons themselves, they're going to push. And the part you didn't identify dealing here is dealing with the penalties for associations not complying. The penalty is pretty severe, and that is going to be dangled over our heads like a Damocles sword forever, just like all the other things that they threaten us with litigation over every time we don't comply with whatever it is that they think that they're entitled to. So be expecting that, and that's, if nothing else, one of the reasons for seeing if you can't comply in existing places rather than fighting. We're here to help you reach the best solution for the association generally while avoiding litigation, very frankly. And I think in this circumstance, that's our job. And avoiding litigation will probably mean granting them permission, but granting them permission with all of the requirements that are here, because now you have a statute that would support your logic that you could throw back at the judge and say, this is what we did, so that you're going to be successful. You don't have to incur unreasonable fees. As a typical example, in the high rises on Lakeshore Drive, to get a new transformer is a 24 to 36 month wait, period. You just can't get a new transformer. So again, if you have a building that is limited because they don't have the electrical energy supply, and Adam can speak and explain that more, it's going to take them 2 to 3 years before they can get a transformer. Maybe Adam can work his magic. Lots of people in the industry that work there all the time get sometimes the suppliers in Commonwealth Edison to recognize it's a real need and push it up on the order list, but it's still going to take 6 to 9 months, even that, very frankly. So nothing's going to happen immediately because somebody has a Tesla. It's just not going to happen, very frankly. And except to the extent that you're required to have rules and regulations in place and respond to them within 60 days. And my comment to all of you that are not attorneys is the first thing you need to do is get an attorney who understands this and can help you implement rules and regulations. And the second thing I would say is all of you that are listening that are non-attorneys and that are association managers or association board members, hire somebody right now, like us, if I can put in a plug, or Chris, to come up with the necessary and appropriate rules and regulations as a part of the process now, so you have it in place and you're not faced with having a difficult way to deal with the responses within the 60-day time period. You anticipate, you plan, you put the rules in place now, and you move forward, expecting that you're going to have to deal with it in a realistic fashion, instead of saying, I don't have to deal with it. You have to deal with it this way, because if you don't, you're probably going to be in a lawsuit, and you don't want the lawsuit. Lots of attorneys will take this just for the possibility they're going to win on a contingent basis and pick up a legal fee at the end of the case. And that's going to cost the association money, because on our side, nobody's going to do it on a contingent basis. They're going to do it for fees. So it's a smart way to plan and move forward in this regard, and start planning and doing it now, because the legislation goes into effect the first of the year. Be in place before the demands come out and start being made to you. And they're going to tell you that it applies. And very frankly, nobody's going to read the introduction. And so they're not going to see those words. Only another attorney would. So you're going to either have Chris or Jim or one of the other attorneys that has actually studied this act and knows this act and knows the in and outs, who could say, you're up the creek. You know, you could say, you don't have to, you're not up the creek. You can walk away from it. Here's what you have to do. Boom, boom, boom. So, get on it. I've said enough, except I wanted to say, if you are dealing with putting it in a common element, you will by the nature of what's going on, go through more that, or if you're dealing with a deeded space, you will go out of that space and through the common element in order to get to the meter box. It's just automatic. So, and that you have control over. So you ought to realize that you do have controls and limitations. And if it's a common element, you should realize you have those rights and responsibilities. In fact, one of the ones that I dealt with in California, one owner actually came in with a full set of plans that had everything right. The other guy, who is on the board, by the way, and didn't even come to the board, put it in, and he actually ran the conduit and the electrical connection up to his box in his unit. His unit was on the first floor. All the fuse of the circuit, all the individual meters were kind of below his unit. So his electrician that he hired did the right thing. He built it right. I'm standing there in amazement and looking at it. It was all done right, and I didn't expect it to find it that way. And I couldn't complain, except to the extent that he went through and drilled holes through the common elements in order to get up to his fuse box, his circuit breaker box, and come back down from the circuit breaker box and bring it over to the pole, to the concrete post that was next to his vehicle, where he put his charging device. And so all of this has to be looked at. It has to be viewed, and in each building it's going to be different, and the amount of the cost is going to be different. But at least right now, even if you're letting them do it, the cost is the unit owners. And we have a bunch of questions that are out there that probably are better for Adam, except there's one saying underground garage, 12 needed spaces. Really beautiful question, because it raises another issue. Current fire suppression will not put out an EV fire. Who pays for the new system? Well, my first answer is no fire prevention systems that I know of put out an EV fire. None. So one of the problems that we have here is at this stage, because of the fires that are occurring, we probably should prohibit EV vehicles from parking inside because it could cause the whole building to go down. And fire departments across the country so far, when there have been EV fires, they just let them burn out until they're gone. And the fire suppression stuff that may work has this PFAS chemical in it, this forever chemical. And most of the time, fire departments aren't even using that anymore because it's too toxic. And it's causing all kinds of cancer in the firemen. And there have just been a bunch of articles about that in the paper, in the local paper, as a matter of fact. So with that,
Thank you, Marshall. Thank you, Jim. I think it jolts us, sorry about the pun, into thinking what our boards are going to do, how we're going to coordinate with the managers, and we should start thinking about this. I know in our subdivision, we already have people in condominium single buildings that have installed these on their own. And again, these are people driving Teslas, and no one has done anything or thought about this for our board. And again, a seminar like this will actually direct boards what to do, who to contact. And as we segue into Adam, he's going to, from Alara Engineering, is going to educate us on the engineering load study, how to retrofit your parking area for the EV charging, and also telling us about the utilities. Again, who pays, how it's going to be formulated. So Adam, thank you. It's all yours.
Great, thank you. If somebody could bring up somebody was gonna have the presentation up.
Yes, I'll bring it up. I'm sorry,
fine.
Diane, I thought there was going to be a break in between these sessions. No?
Actually, no, because we're gonna
Okay.
go for 6:45 to 6:55 due to shortening of Chris's time frame. So we can just take a pause if you need to get it ready.
It's between session 3 and 4. Yeah.
Actually, right. Sessions 3 and 4, we'll have our break at 6:45 to 6:55. Mary Ellen, how are we doing on the questions? Are we
Oh.
answering as we go?
We're doing great. I'm just holding some of them for Adam, so go for
Okay,
it, Adam.
all right, thank you.
Yeah, so I'll go through mine, and when possible, just bring up the slides, and that'll go along with it. So
Okay, thank you.
Adam Sanders with Alara Engineering, as I previously introduced myself. So we're going to go through some very basic things with regards to EV chargers, as well as dive into some of the complications on the electrical side. But I'm going to try to keep it as simple and less complex as possible, because this does get quite complex very quickly on the electrical engineering side. So if you can go to the next slide real quick. One of the very first questions we always get from people is just, what are the EV chargers? How fast do they charge, etc. So there's really 3 levels of chargers. That's how it's classified, in level 1, level 2, and level 3. So level 1, that's just a standard outlet on the wall. That's a 120 volt single phase outlet. That's going to obviously charge a vehicle slowly. So it's about 2 to 4 miles per hour. So, if you plugged in depending on the car and the vehicle, et cetera, but if you plugged in a car that, you may have drained your battery quite low in the charge, it could take days to charge it. So that's obviously not a reasonable way to charge it if somebody's doing daily commutes. The level 2 charger, that's going to be a 3-phase charger. You're going to get 10 to 40 miles per hour out of that. Depends on the charger, depends on the available power, depends on a lot of things coming into it. And it takes hours to charge. So those level 2 chargers, those are the typical chargers that we're basing our electrical engineering on for multifamily buildings. Just because the idea there is you can drive to work for the day, come home. When you get home, if you're driving a substantial amount of miles every day, you can simply plug in at the end of the day, and by the time you wake up in the morning, your car is fully charged and ready to go. Level 3 charger is, again, it's a 3-phase, but that's going to charge your car very quickly. That obviously requires a much more substantial amount of power from your electrical grid. So that'll charge hundreds of miles per hour. This is typically not what we look at in multifamilies, just because the need to charge a car that quickly in a multifamily residence isn't typically there. Also, it becomes quite cost prohibitive. Obviously, the more power we need to charge, the more expensive the electrical system is going to be to support that. So level 3 chargers, where are those? Well, those are, if we talk about Tesla, those are like the Tesla superchargers on the side of the road. So if you're doing a road trip in your electric vehicle, that's what you're going to charge into, so or plug into. So for the purpose of our discussion today, we're really focusing on those level 2 chargers, and those are likely what's being retrofit into garages and parking garages and et cetera. So that kind of gives everybody the idea of what to expect out of your charger and what we're looking at to install.
I think the photos on your slide help. They go to a question earlier that I said I couldn't answer from a technical side on restrictions on size of the charger. So here's a good visual of where the level 2 is probably going to be okay in most parking spaces, but a level 3, probably you're not going to have the space to put something like that in an individual parking space or to serve an individual parking space.
Yeah, you're correct there, Jim. And also those level 2, we get a lot of questions about manufacturers and model numbers of chargers. There are a lot of level 2 chargers out there. There's also, quite frankly, several level 3 chargers out there. So the exact make and model of the level 2 charger that gets installed, we're less concerned about that. Granted, the chargers that are coming out continue to evolve in their, I guess I'll call it sophistication, right? Some of them are having the capability of having, credit cards that you can accept a credit card and charge overnight. Some of them literally just get mounted to the wall, so they're even smaller than the one that I showed in the picture there. But these are just examples of projects we've done in buildings of what got installed, and that those just happen to be the chargers that those clients decided to move forward with. So we'll go to the next slide. Yep, perfect. So another common question we get before we really dive into more electrical engineering here is, what is the plug that I should have for my car? Because a lot of people aren't as readily educated about electric vehicles as they are internal combustion engine vehicles. So EVs versus ICE. So the picture above, I found a picture that I thought demonstrated pretty well. So the darker colored one is called an NACS, North American Charging Standard. The lighter colored one, that's called CCS, which is Combined Charging System. So the NACS, that is what Tesla, that's their proprietary connector. And you may have seen in the news recently, which we have been following very closely, but a lot of manufacturers are adopting that charger, which is proprietary to Tesla, and starting to produce cars in the near future that incorporates that plug on it. The CCS that was developed to be a global standard that's used in Europe and other areas of the world. It's still used here in America right now, but the trend moving forward seems to be that a lot of the manufacturers that are producing vehicles for the American market are going to be moving towards that NACS, which is the Tesla standard, really. So you can see the difference there, right? There's one's kind of smaller and sleeker, the other one's a little larger, more cumbersome. So I think you can kind of see why everybody's moving to one here in America, but that's kind of what you're looking at that you physically plug into the car.
Adam, there's a question related to this. Actually, it's a comment from a fellow engineer that says, I haven't seen any of the equipment that may be available on the market to answer some of the questions that have been coming up. But I do have to believe it's going to be available in the next few years. Things such as charging timers, Bluetooth notification of the car for the car owner, billing systems, charge users by the minute, when charging is done, and these kinds of things. So this was from a comment.
Yeah, most of those things are available now. So like, I don't mean to single out Tesla, but we'll talk about Tesla. So Tesla, a lot of these cars now are coming with apps that you put on your phone that will give you notifications. You'll be able to see the car charging on your phone and watch it directly. A lot of those level 3 chargers that I talked about that you use for road trips, you pay as you go on those. So a lot of that technology is already there. It's just that they're starting to incorporate that into those level 2 chargers that we would expect to see going into multifamily type buildings. Good question. We'll go to the next slide. All right. Existing buildings and phase implementations. Most of the buildings that we look at, there's some sort of phase implementation that we're typically looking at here. And why is that? Well, there's typically it's a little covered up there, but short-term needs, long-term needs, and then there's a long-term implementation process. Well, the short-term need right now is that typically a lot of the buildings that we look at, they only have a few electric vehicles in them, right? So while we do have some buildings wanting to do a broader adoption of electric vehicle chargers in their garages, their parking structures, whatever they have, a lot of them just need a handful of them right now. Okay, well, a handful of them is easier than broad adoption, obviously, from an electrical engineering standpoint. However, you still need to be doing them responsibly. So as Jim and Marshall and Chris all talked about, they still have to be done responsibly. A lot of buildings that we work with are going direct to an electrical contractor. We strongly recommend that if you do that, that's fine. Make sure you're using a good electrical contractor. And we also recommend, whether it's Alara or another firm or somebody, have an electrical engineer review the work before they do it to make sure that you don't have functionality issues afterwards in your electrical system. You don't want to have breakers popping. You don't want to fail a ComEd transformer or something like that. So you just want to make sure you're doing this responsibly. And I think you can hear that theme from everybody on this call here that we're talking about, is that we're talking about a pretty heavy electrical usage and a pretty heavy change in the electrical system in your building. So to make sure you're doing this responsibly and doing it correctly is pretty critical. Typically, if you want to put in a handful, if you bring a good electrical engineer on site, you can usually survey your electrical system and run some pretty basic calcs and determine if you have some power available now. It's not untypical for that electrical engineer to ask to see some recent ComEd bills. ComEd bills typically would show you the peak usage during that billing period. And so it's not untypical to enact a few. It can be done relatively easy as long as you do it correctly and safely and with the correct guidance. Long-term needs, yep.
I'm sorry, Adam, there's a related question. So the question has to do with, if an owner charges their vehicle in their own garage attached to a townhome, for example, and only uses the car for short trips some days each week, and how does this impact the power available for the rest of the HOA? Are they required to notify according to what's in place now? But this is, of course, a question that has to do with an existing structure.
Yeah, so I'll answer the aspects I can answer. I think some of the other gentlemen on the call might be able to answer some of the other aspects of that question. But depending on how much you can drive, you're going to drive each week. You could see those level of chargers, right? So I think the question is kind of hinting at, can I survive on a level 1 charger? Well, if you drive few enough miles, it's possible. We'd likely recommend the installation of a level 2, because there might be a time when you need that additional capacity. Now, the other aspect of that question is kind of hinting at is with regards to diversity in your electrical system. Diversity just means, how many people are plugged in at a time, how much power are they each pulling, et cetera, et cetera. At this point, and we anticipate code changing some point in the future to dictate to us what diversity we can take and how to calculate that. Right now that I know of, that I've seen, or the most recent time I've looked, there's nothing in the code that tells us what diversity we can take, or any diversity, quite frankly. And so electrical engineers are having to navigate this without any really strict codes enforcing how we calculate this amperage draw. And so
how might you be guiding associations then in terms of, is this a first come, first serve in terms of electricity being consumed by the first ones there for chargers? Or how are you guiding associations in terms of being able to set up this kind of short-term, long-term planning?
Yeah, and I'll answer from my perspective again. Somebody else can feel free to jump in on this from the legal standpoint, but because most of our clients only have a handful of electrical vehicles, the short-term need isn't that complicated, right? You can install them where needed as long as it's done in a, I guess, an equitable manner, right? It needs to be accessible for those who need it, in our opinion. And if you only have 2 EVs and the electrical system can accommodate it, then the association can make the decision as to where to physically put them, and that probably require input from their legal counsel and their attorneys to provide input on that. I don't know if anybody else wants to jump in on that question at all.
Well, the first part of the question was talking about level 1 in their garage. If it's in a garage, it's likely it's already separately metered to that, say, townhome. And so they're just going to get charged for the electricity they use, assuming it's a situation, Adam, where it's not a drain on the rest of the building. To the extent it's say for whatever reason, the electricity for the garages, say, are 1 meter or metered together for a building, and so that one person may be using more juice than everyone else, then maybe that's something an association wants to know, because all of a sudden they're getting higher electric bills and they're going to want to know why, and they would deal with it that way. So it's up to the individual associations how to deal with that, or to implement something that people have to notify them if they're going to be doing level 1 charging.
Assume that if it's a separate freestanding building, which is the way it was described in the question, that they have their own separate meter and they have their own separate, obviously, circuit breaker system. So the first question that I would have is, what's the capacity of the system? And is that outlet that they're using in the garage was it there already? Because then it was counted in the capacity of the system, or was it an added? And is it a level 1 or is it a level 2 that they're charging? Because if it's a level 2, then that's a whole different ball game right in of itself. And then you get to the question of, does that added capacity affect the transformer? Are they anywhere near the limits of the transformer capacity in the system if there's one transformer powering that particular building or subdivision? So that's where the question comes in. And my answer to this person that asked the question is, you should have notified them, in my opinion, and you should have had some way of determining that before you added your system. Now, if you're on a level 1, I'd be less concerned, because and if it was an existing outlet in your garage, because that capacity was figured in when they put it in. It's, because that capacity is based upon every outlet. They count every outlet in the house. They count every appliance in the house. They look at every piece of equipment in the house, and those add up, and they use an average amount of power corresponding to that. If you have a standard 20 ampere circuit with 2 outlets, it's a 20 ampere circuit, and they will say that there's 20 ampere capacity for that circuit, and then they'll add up the total capacity. I have a very high capacity service to my house because I'm a nut, and I am a car guy, and I have a garage and workshop and a lot of cars, and I have capacity to run a welder in my garage, which draws, I don't know, 100 amps on its own, very frankly, for the kind of welding that we do for building race cars and stuff like that. I don't do it anymore, but the house had to be built with that capacity, and it had to pass the village code, and you actually have to provide the municipality with a listing of all the outlets and a total of the capacity in every community, in the city of Chicago, in any of the suburbs. So if it's an existing outlet and he's able to plug it in and trickle charge it at 2 to 4 miles an hour, that's fine. If it's a level 2, I don't know the answer, but you should have had somebody come out and analyze that and determine whether you are within capacity, both of your panel and of the system. If you're in the panel, you probably don't have to do any more, but I would have told the association that you have that in any case, so that they could factor that in for the next request, because there's going to be a next request at this point in time. Just like Diane said, she's got a couple in her association, and they put them in and they never asked, but they're using the system. And they didn't even think about it. And from what I understand, at least one of them is an electrical engineer, and they should have figured it out, but they didn't. So, you know, they just plugged in their Tesla. That's all they did. So we're sitting in this kind of strange scenario right now.
So Adam, thank you. So Adam, do you want to continue with that next slide, or do you want to take some related questions?
Well, let me add on to Marshall's thing. I'll finish this. I'm watching the questions that come in as well. We'll get there, I think. Let me keep going for a little bit to help some understandings. One thing to add on to what is that, if that's okay, Mary?
Yeah, thank you.
Okay. One thing to add on to Marshall is, I don't want everybody thinking that, you know, there's a parking garage and there's a bunch of 120 volt outlets all over the place. The electrical design for that original building probably didn't account for an electric vehicle being plugged into every single outlet throughout the entire garage, right? They would have taken some diversity on that. So I don't want everybody to think there's an outlet, I can go plug cars in all over the place and be totally fine. That's typically not how designs were done in the past. Obviously, electric vehicles are a newer thing, and a lot of the buildings that we work on were built in the 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s, et cetera, right? And so I don't want everybody thinking they can go plug a whole bunch of electric vehicles in and then breakers start popping, et cetera. So anyways, I'll get back to this slide. So long-term needs, that's where the electrical engineering becomes much more demanding and much more much heavier requirements on your electrical engineering that you have to do here. Obviously, you could see how much going from a level 1 to a level 2, how much more miles you can get out of that. Well, that equates to the amount of amps that you're, and the amount of watts that you're putting into that car, the amount of power you're entering into that car. And so when you do broader EV adoption in a parking structure, that's a lot more power that's required. So then suddenly we need to start looking at things in a much more in-depth manner. And so that's where we need to come out and start talking about things like possibly doing a 30-day load study. 30-day load study is where you'd have an electrical contractor come in. They're going to strap some sensors on the existing wires. And for 30 days, you're going to measure the power usage in that system. And the reason we do that, and we don't do this in every situation, but we've been starting to do it more and more. And the reason for that is because we can actually measure the actual power usage in that system, determine how conservatively sized the existing system is versus the actual usage. And then that can be used as a basis of a calculation to determine how much excess capacity do we have left now. And if we want to enact this many EV chargers, how much more capacity do we need to add to that system? And adding that additional capacity to the system, that's where things can get very complicated and very difficult very, very quickly. We're dealing with a lot of electricity here, a lot of power draw. And so modify an existing system to be able to accommodate that when it was really never originally designed to do that, that's the difficulty here, right? And so, and that's where we start diving into things where we start needing to talk about what I think Jim mentioned earlier is like individual meters. Are you doing some sort of sub-metering or we talked about figured a flat rate or some rate that you charge them back based on the mileage that they drive. How are you doing that? Those things impact the design, not just the electrical design and how we literally flow the electricity from ComEd to the electric vehicles, but also, if we want individual ComEd meters for each, for here in Chicago, ComEd meters for each individual EV charger, that starts to take up some physical space, so that might need to require either consuming some parking spaces or some other physical space at the facility that we can accommodate this equipment so that you start to have an architectural impact on the physical spaces in the building to accommodate this additional electrical requirement, additional electrical equipment. And so the typical implementation for long-term process here is that the first step is just to simply do an engineering study. We've been calling them EV charger studies. So that would include things like we're going to put together a preliminary schematic design as to what is this electrical system going to look like to be able to accommodate this additional power draw in the building. Some preliminary implementation costs with estimates as to what do we think is going to cost the association. How do we phase it? Because even though you have the short-term and the long-term needs, the long-term need likely wants to be phased as well, because it's more likely that you're building over the next, let's just say 10 years for discussion purposes. It's going to go from having a couple electric vehicles to be dominant electric vehicles potentially. That transition there, you may not want to put in all the electric vehicle chargers day one. You might want to put in a certain amount each year, for example. So how does that schematic design accommodate some sort of phased implementation consideration? And obviously, whatever the design needs to factor in how is the association billing for the electrical usage, as well as the many legal impacts that come into play here. And we'll get into that a little bit more on the next slide. But then after you do the study, typically we are engaged to do a detailed design with including the considerations that we listed above there. You take that detailed design, you competitively bid it to qualified contractors, and then you move into the construction implementation. So you kind of execute this the way you execute a lot of typical, I'll call them large scale projects that occur in associations. You start with obtaining some basic information with a study that's a small cost. After that, you move into the design, you bid it, and then you implement it, right? So this is a project like any other project, is just heavily electrically centric, and it needs to be done correctly. Why don't we move to the next slide, and I'll talk about that one, then we'll come back to some of the questions that are out there. So I talked about the 30-day load study. On the right there is a drawing. I just grabbed a representative drawing, and this is what we would call a single line diagram. So you can see at the bottom it says electrical new work riser diagram. This represents the electrical infrastructure in that building in particular. And everything that's gray is all the existing. Everything that's bold is what we are either affecting or installing new to accommodate electric vehicles that are being broadly adopted in that garage. So I felt like this was a really good drawing to represent like how much you have to impact your electrical system in a building in a very simple way for you guys to see it. This is a major impact to your electrical. All the way not only within your building, but obviously the electrical engineering should extend back to the electrical service coming into the building. You may or may not have enough electrical power to accommodate what you want to do with the electric vehicles. More than likely, you don't have that much power coming into your building currently, depending on the facility that we're looking at. And so these electrical designs need to take into current code considerations, any future code considerations that we can anticipate at that time, a phase implementation, and all the other things that we talked about, as well as physical constraints. We are installing panels, transformers, conduit, wire, the EV chargers themselves. The EV chargers themselves are pretty straightforward. They're going at the parking spaces like we showed, but all that other equipment needs a physical location to be located. And likely your existing electrical room can't accommodate that additional equipment. So I know earlier we were reading through some of the legal language, and I remember in there they were talking about some of the architectural impacts. Well, that ties into it. We need physical space for equipment. Also, common elements versus limited common elements. You can see here in that drawing, a lot of this equipment is main distribution equipment that's going to feed multiple electric vehicles, right? So like we do in other types of projects for associations, we're affecting things that affect multiple electric vehicles, but also individual electric vehicles. So that's where you need to turn to your legal experts to come back and help dictate who is required or who owns what, who's financing what here, right? And how does that division of responsibility occur in this system according to what the laws impact as well as the individual declaration? So as Marshall indicated earlier, we would also recommend that you engage your legal team earlier on to help define some of these things and get out ahead of it rather than behind it, especially as it relates to this. So you can also see that a lot of the clients we talk to are very concerned about the EV chargers themselves and their cost. The electrical infrastructure to serve all those EV chargers is really usually the large cost, the bulk of the cost. And that is where the heavy electrical engineering comes in. This also ties into, decarbonization that's occurring around the nation and is coming to Chicago, quite frankly. And the electrification of buildings. So, we're phasing out the burning of fossil fuel, going much toward to electricity. So some of the clients that have come to us with regards to EV chargers, we've been also challenging them to think even broader scale than that, to start having us look at HVAC systems and plumbing systems that in the future may have to be electrified to accommodate decarbonization. Then we go to the next slide. I have one more slide that's a summary, and I think that'll do it. So building type affects the design, the existing infrastructure affects the design, high rise, low rise, private parking, public parking, different types of building, physical constraints. And so all these things really need to be taken into consideration. These projects get quite complex very quickly, and every facility is unique and has different solutions to it. So with that, maybe Mary will move on to some of the questions that I see are coming in.
Thank you. Some of the questions have to do with some specifics. For those of us who are not AMP savvy, could you say something about an example of common electrical appliances that would require the same amount of electricity as a type 1, type 2, type 3? Like how much stuff goes through there, and what would that be comparable to?
Yeah, so like a level 1 charger where you're plugging a vehicle in, picture your something that uses a healthy amount of electricity from a single outlet. Maybe a hair dryer or something along those lines. If you're doing like a level 2, obviously then it's a 3-phase plug and it's using more. So then you're thinking more along the lines of what you're, if you're thinking of a single family home, think more along the lines of your HVAC unit, the compressor that's running on your cooling is something along those lines. So you can see that it's, if you think about a single family home, it becomes a rather dominant electrical load in that building.
Thank you. There's another question. Was there another answer, another input from the panel? Okay. So
level 2, because that would be what the capacity is of most 3-phase lines of 220 lines. You're going to run 50 amps or 100 amps, up to 100 amps. That's what the circuit breaker is going to be. So
yeah,
just work from that. An additional comment, however, that is a question that you haven't addressed is the actual devices there, other than a level 3, are actually very cheap and they're very sophisticated. Adam didn't quite say as much about how sophisticated they are. And you can actually have a company come out that will basically put them in if there's the infrastructure there, and they will collect the money. And their machines you put in a plastic, and you could actually do the same thing even within your association. You could set up an account with the credit card companies, and you can have it at the association, and you can have it with credit cards. So people living in the building would have to have a special card to unlock it, and or their credit card on file with the system, and that would be handled at the association. And that's capable right now, so that they could just plug in their credit card and it get charged on a common charger. The big problem you're going to have is all this reservation problems and the amount of time it's going to take it doesn't work on a level 1. It's just never going to happen. It's got to be a level 2. So they've got to be willing to commit to a level 2 or a couple 3 level 2s in order to do that, like the picture he was showing. And from there, it's easy. The rest of it is don't sweat it. It's very easy. I even have some places where I've been told they might give you the equipment just because. Give you the charger. Yeah. Actually,
Yeah, and Marshall, I'd add on to that. I'd encourage everybody. So me, for example, the town that I live in, I know my local town gives incentives for installing electric vehicles, so a charger. So if I want to install electrical vehicle charger in my house here, my local community will reimburse me for almost the complete cost of it. So the electric vehicle itself, and it varies from town to town and location to location, but I'd encourage anybody who wants that to look into incentives that are applicable for your particular situation.
So Adam, there's a couple of questions actually about that too. It's things like have to do with how do you keep multiple charging owners from charging on a station that is designed to be one use only. Is it true that some systems shut off automatically? How does that help?
Yeah. So let me speak to that a little bit. So electric vehicles in general, you set up in the vehicle how much you want it to charge, right? So for example, you want to charge, again, we'll just use Tesla as the example. You want to charge your Tesla up to 80%. You can set that limit in your car, and once it gets to 80%, it stops charging. Even though it's plugged in, it stops pulling power. Just like anything else, you plug a light into an outlet. If you turn the light off, it stops drawing power, right? Same thing. With regards to plugging multiple cars in at the same time, and what do you do? Well, that comes down to the design of the electrical system. Are you going to design your electrical system to accommodate 2 cars being plugged in at the same time, or are you going to accommodate 1 car being plugged in at the same time? If you want to design it for 1 car at a time, there are some companies out there that are developing products that are trying to do things like, hey, Jim, Marshall, Chris, and I are all plugging into the same network. And maybe I drove a lot that day and I'm down to 10%. And Jim, Chris, and Marshall are all sitting at 70%. And we all plug in at the same time. There are companies out there trying to develop systems that'll say, well, we're going to allow you to more aggressively size your electrical system and reduce those first-time costs. And by making it a little bit smarter and saying, hey, we're going to give Adam the majority of the power because we know by the morning he needs that power, and Jim, Marshall, and Chris need a small amount of power because by the morning for them to get to 80%, it's not much, right? So there are some systems that are coming out of those nature. We've looked into them a little bit. We're not really very confident in them yet, although I'm sure that they're coming out quicker and quicker with more and more reliability. But that doesn't always necessarily, it gets complex. It doesn't always necessarily result back in first-time cost savings of the electrical system that supports all that. It's heavily dependent on what you want in your building and the system you want. So in the end, you essentially still need the power to get there. So the infrastructure still needs to be there. It's just that there's companies out there working on ways to make it smarter to try to help reduce those costs.
So Adam, there's a related question about the what have you heard that's coming out as far as protecting this equipment? Things that are outside, as we know, are subject to salt damage, plow damage, water flooding, all these kinds of things. What are you hearing in terms of what kind of damages that can be sustained in these kind of outdoor settings?
Yeah, so maybe it's good for Jim if you can flip back to that one first slide where I show the chargers. So first of all, if it's something outside, it should have the proper NEMA rating. So that's an electrical device that's sitting outside that it can withstand weather, snow, rain, et cetera, et cetera. So electrical NEMA ratings already easily accommodate that, and it's done that for decades at this point. And then second, a lot of this is some some common sense, right? So you can see the picture on the right, that level 3 charger, a couple bollards in front of the electric vehicle charger really helps protect that quite well. And then it's dependent on how, how protective you want to be. Do you want some angle iron around it, some bollards, et cetera, et cetera. So we haven't really seen many issues with that. Snow plows and things like that, it'd be a similar nature, right? Do you want to have some sort of bollard or some sort of protection device in front of the EV charger to help protect it? Snow plows and things like that is one thing, but usually the thing that clients are more worried about is somebody going to back that Chevy Bolt back into the electric vehicle and damage it because they just drove and hit it, kind of thing. So we do that at times. You can see the level 2 on the left. There's no protection in front of that, and it's perfectly fine, especially if you can mount that up on the wall. That protects it quite well. So there's typically I'll call it common sense or reasonable ways to help protect this equipment, just like you to protect anything else that would be outside.
Thank you.
Just let me add, that problem, you have to recognize if you're outside, it is inherently difficult. First of all, you're going to have vandalism and theft. People would cut the cords without even realizing. They'll cut the wires and they'll lift that whole box up if it's not bolted into the ground and take it away. And you could expect that without any question in the Chicago metropolitan area. And they'll sell it to somebody. Somebody will buy it. So I don't know how you account for that other than looking at what the commercial operators do in their systems. And in the commercial operators, they're bolted into the ground. They do all kinds of things. But if you look at the statistics, if you look at the information, you'll find that somehow the Tesla systems that are outside all seem to work all the time. Whereas everybody else, all these other aftermarket people, the people that are going out that are trying to develop their own charging networks around the country, they're terrible. And they're damaged and they don't work and you can't get them to work. And it's a real problem if you read any of these car magazines about how to find a place to charge, particularly up in Wisconsin, let's say, if you're going to Wisconsin. If you're going to Wisconsin and you're pulling a boat, don't take an electric car, period. Don't take an electric car. It won't get there. It will not get there. And every one of the magazines will tell you that. So what I'm telling you is it needs maintenance. It needs service at a different level than when they're protected, than when they're inside. And so you can expect a lot more maintenance on them, a lot more need to protect them in addition to the maintenance, because weather, especially in Chicago, is going to beat these things up. It just will.
Yeah, thank you very much. Getting back to an insurance question, I want to make sure that I'm remembering what was said clearly. One of the things I heard was that as far as insurance is concerned, that it is important for an association to require an updated insurance from an owner. Is that what I heard, panel?
Yes, that the owner has to have liability insurance, and obviously the association's going to want that updated year by year to make sure the insurance is still in place.
The building is covered because condominium association building insurance is first, as opposed to anybody else, whether they're responsible or not. So if you have a fire as a result of one of these things catching on fire, the association could have to pay for the repair. As you know, those costs have escalated exponentially without even worrying about what these things can bring to bear. And I think in a few years, that's going to be a question of how many electric vehicles are you parking inside as opposed to outside? And I think that may be a cause for concern with the insurance companies as time goes by. The other side of that picture is, by the way, they're making such enormous strides in charging systems and in battery capacity and battery charging that my guess is in 3 years, you're going to be able to fully charge most vehicles in an hour to 2 hours, so that you can make an appointment in these charging systems outside of the building, and you won't need necessarily to have charging systems in the building. At that point in time, we may upgrade them and change things anyhow as time goes by. It's really mainly a change in the battery architecture. They're going from lithium ion to lithium I think it is
Phosphate.
phosphate, and actually water is the next one. And in 15 years, they're going to use fusion altogether. They're going to have little fusion engines. Is my projection, hypothecation, because they've actually created fusion that actually generates more power than it uses to create the fusion reaction. So, we're going to see an explosion in fusion power, electrical power being generated by fusion reactors, not atomic reactors. Fusion reactors won't come in my lifetime, I don't think. But it's 20 years away, maybe 10 years away, because they're working on it really hard. So a lot of this is going to change, and in 10 years, the stuff you put in today may be outmoded, which is the other side of the equation. And it likely will be outmoded.
So as an add-on to the panel, what have you heard about whether there are any special charges to standard condo insurance policies for unit owners? What are you hearing about?
Can I add to the insurance conversation? Because I just kind of want to point out, at least in my mind, the insurance requirements that Jim was talking about earlier, because he's talking about what is in Section 30 of the Electric Vehicle Charging Act. But that is different than the sections in the Condominium Property Act that allow associations or boards to require owners to maintain certain types of insurance and provide proof of that insurance. So there's, if that law that Jim is talking about doesn't automatically change what policy or rule that the association may already have on the books. So that association may have to revisit what their policies and their rules and regulations are as to what types of insurance owners are required to maintain and what needs to be provided to them. So I think that there's a lot of different insurance stuff going on, and there's different laws that apply to the insurance requirements or aspects of what owners are required to insure or not required to insure. So I think I just want to bring out or emphasize that difference. And so if an owner now has already installed it, has HOA 6 insurance, right? And then they install an EV, do they have to provide an updated HO6 policy to the association? To me, that probably depends upon what kind of rules and regulations that association already has in place. So the association probably needs to go back and revisit all their policy procedures. I think that's what Jim was kind of going at earlier, and Marshall, I think, mentioned this earlier, is now's a good time to start thinking about the association's policies and regulations pertaining to electric vehicles, and maybe looking at what this Electric Vehicle Charging Act has in place in Section 30 and using that as a guide to try and figure out what reasonable regulations the association should try and put in place now.
They're going to need.
We have to look at this.
The automobile insurance. They can't go uninsured. They're going to need $1 million worth of coverage on liability on their automobile insurance, because that's what we're talking about, is potential injury from the cars, from the chargers and the system that goes along with it. But I think that's actually, it's a very interesting question, Chris, because I never distinguished between the automobile coverage and the coverage from the electrical charger. I mean, what if somebody somehow gets themselves electrocuted fiddling around with the electric charger, and whether they should or should not? Whose liability is it? Is it the association, or is it the owner of that charger? And do they need a supplemental policy on their building coverage because of that, as opposed to their car coverage?
Hey, Marshall, if I can, I'm sorry, this is Jory Carrick. If I could just comment on this real quick as well. In just thinking about insurance and the delineation of coverage and who would be responsible. One of the things that you mentioned earlier was fire suppression systems in buildings that can't handle electrical fire. So if we require an owner to have a liability policy for peril to the building, but the building is completely destroyed as a result of one vehicle catching fire that could be suppressed because of the failure of that fire system, or just not having the adequacy to handle it, the association's policy is first and foremost. It's still primary in that coverage.
Yeah.
So in assessing that risk, an adjuster is going to realize there's no way that we can make an owner carry enough liability to cover a total catastrophic loss of property, they financially couldn't absorb it because they would have to duplicate the cost of the association's policy per se to take on that risk.
Right.
So to analyze this further as we get further down this road on the electrical vehicles, side of things, if in fact we get to a point where we retrofit older buildings, existing buildings with electrical chargers for electrical vehicles, and we require this standalone HO6 policy with some liability, the association's main primary coverage for total peril and destruction is still going to fall on each and every homeowner, and any increases related there too.
Right.
In my opinion.
I think you're right.
Thank
think
you,
you're-
Cory. I
well,
think it's time
Well,
we have.
you got to really break that down about it. The problem is there's two parts to that. One is if the building is destroyed. Two, if there's injury or property damage, that's different. I mean, mostly injury. One is liability coverage. The other is destruction damage. And you have to distinguish between the two. We're first party on building damage. I'm not sure we're first party on liability. I think so on the building, but I don't know what those limits are in this circumstance, and I'd have to go back and look. But you have to make sure that the individual owner, because the owner is going to get sued anyhow, one way or another, and the building may also get sued, and you have to make sure that they have coverage at least on the liability side, and I would say a reasonable amount on the property side. Because it's possible, just like in Florida, that you're going to the damage is in excess of the association coverage on a rebuild, even though it says full replacement cost. People don't really realize. Look at the policies, right? It's a real problem there. We've now made it clearer in the Condominium Property Act, but it hasn't quite identified all the 3 additions or 4 additions that there have to be. Removal of all the damage and debris, rebuilding to code, which may be additional, and a few other things. There's one other thing as additional. Those are all the Condo Act, but they don't apply in a common interest community, and they don't apply in a co-op. So you have to look at what it is that you're dealing with. You're dealing with a co-op or a common interest community that isn't a condominium. They don't have the same coverage requirements as in a condominium, unless you insist on that for your client. Tell the difference. You can't get condominium coverage in many community associations if it's a multi-unit building.
So I think we're gonna go to break here, Diane, is that right? And then.
Yes, I think we should wrap it up right now. And basically, I think we need to, as an association, we need to think about the short term and we need to think about the long term. The short term would be right now to start contacting your legal professionals, your electric and also your engineering vendors and your insurance providers as these requests become more and more prevalent. Plus, I think every association should start thinking about writing their electrical vehicle policy just for protection. The long term, think about what you're going to do with that parking lot. Think about, again, some of these new chargers that are coming in are almost, Adam, I just clarify one thing. There's these pads that could go right underneath the car. Will that be coming soon? I've read about those chargers that do eliminate the post type of charging, but
Yeah,
anyway, just the
yeah,
last
there's-
comment.
yeah, there's companies out there trying to develop wireless charging essentially. So, if anybody has a toothbrush that you set in the little thing that charges, that's inductive charging. So there are people trying to develop that you could put that in your garage or put it in the slab of a structure or something. So you literally park a vehicle over it and charge it. Nobody's developed anything that does that at this point. Is it going to become available in the future sometime? Yeah, likely I'd imagine somebody's going to try to develop something along those lines. To double back quick to the life safety aspect of the electric vehicles. So NFPA right now hasn't put forth any standards with regards to fire protection systems, fire suppression systems in parking garages for electric vehicles. Not sure how heavily they're going to push for that. Electric vehicles are already statistically and percentage wise, less electric vehicles catch fire than internal combustion engine vehicles at this point already. So, however, electric vehicle does catch fire, there's runaway in that battery pack. So like Marshall mentioned earlier, it keeps going. That's because the battery triggers the battery triggers the battery. But that rate of incidence is decreasing quite quickly. Considering electric vehicles have been around for less than 20 years, and they're already safer than ICE vehicles that have been around for over 100 years. I think that's saying something about the technology. That's my personal opinion. But we'll see what the future holds with regards to that.
Thank you, Adam. And thank
Yep.
you to the rest of participants up to this point. We're going to take a 10-minute break. So we'll be back at 7:10. And then we'll be hearing from Jory Carrick from Williamson Management. And we will talk about the practical implementation an association will be doing. Thank you very much. We'll see you in about 10 minutes. quick question. We don't leave and come back, do we? We just stay here.
There was one question that I wanted Adam to address maybe, and that is, there is no compatibility between the two electrical plugs for the electrical charging systems.
We
Right.
can add that. We can add that the first question after Corey gives his presentation. How's
Yeah,
that?
That's an
GM
easy one.
GM is not adopting the Tesla system at all. They've announced that, at least for now. Ford did, which was a big, the Tesla stock jumped the day that Ford said that they were going to do it, quite a bit. And there is a plug, an adapter that allows you to use the same charging station for the two. But my experience with people figuring out how to use the adapter and how to get it to work and understanding the issues is such that they're going to tear the whole wire system out of the charging system and mess it up, because they'll never figure it out, or they don't remember and they won't understand. So I think that is an ongoing problem in most of these systems, and all kinds of warning labels are going to have to be put on the equipment, in my opinion, again, because people will not want to understand. And when it doesn't plug in and charge, they're going to try and force it, thinking that that's the way to fix it. And of course, then they're going to break everything. Guess I should go on.
You ready?
Okay, so Diane, are you going to take us back into session? Can you open your mic? Diane, can you open your mic?
Okay, I just wanted to check to see if we were all set to go. And we welcome everybody back. We're all set to continue our last session, which will be with Jory Carrick. And Jory, when you're ready, we'll start learning about the practical aspects of what the association has to do. Thank you.
Thank you, guys. Well, honestly, between Jim, Marshall, Adam, Chris, they've pretty much covered everything with respect to this whole process and how this impacts associations. So one of the good things that came out of this is the fact that it doesn't affect existing associations, other than an individual that wants to kind of come to the board and ask for a charging system. And I think one of the key things that we all have to take out of this is, number one, when it comes to rules and regulations, as you're developing your policy, to Marshall's point earlier, to Jim's point earlier, first and foremost, talk to the attorney. Make sure the attorney can draft, looks at declarations, bylaws, this new act, and constructs a very comprehensive policy that meets the letter of the law. Because the other part of this, when we have homeowners that always request, they do request this, they request, and we go through the ACC process, and we already meet this new law. There's no undue delay. It's the same thing. Number one, we got to deal with safety. We have to have somebody that's going to come in with an ACC form. They're going to have to come in with qualified individuals. They're going to have to come in with an architectural and engineering drawing. They're going to have to purposefully and carefully and electrically engineer this system that fits an old system. Because most of our associations, let's face it, are old, right? It was mentioned 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s. Most of our associations probably averages mid 80s. So how do we retrofit that? The key is safety, proper installation, design and permit. The permitting process itself is going to take care of a lot of this, because the local municipalities are going to require very detailed plans, licensed, bonded, insured contractors that know what they're doing. There's going to be a before, a middle, and an end review and inspection. And at some point it's going to be signed off on. One of the key things that I think was really awesome was, what Marshall mentioned is building certification, as well as what Adam had mentioned. And that's, evaluating loads, right? Like how much load does this building, what can we do to this building to retrofit to bring in this new system? So as it stands right now, talking about just general infrastructure, there's a lot of intrinsic hurdles already. There's barriers to entry for a lot of homeowners to come in and do what they want to do when it comes to having these chargers in their community. If we were to go back and down the road, since we already have this that applies to new associations, and we're already moving to decarbonizing the world, it's only evident that the next step is existing associations and the mandates that might be placed on them. So what's going to happen? Infrastructure, 2 to 3 years to get transformers is a classic barrier to entry. The source, existing versus new electrical metering, how is it going to be metered? How is the account going to allocate? What is it going to be, the association's responsibility versus the homeowner? Separate metering. How are we going to allocate the costs? As far as in engineering, plans, permitting, review and approval, all barriers to entry. What obstacles? Where's the source? Where's the location of the station? What's the distance from the source to the location? How much utilities, underground obstructions are there in bringing those conduits to put those pedestals where they need to go or where they ideally want to go? When we do our Julie digs, what are we going to find underground that's going to stop us from doing what we want to do if we're trying to retrofit an existing association? So we've got a lot of unknown obstructions in this process. The cannibalization of existing parking spaces. What is the policy of the board to allow? How many spaces are we going to allow? If we do go to a point where we're going to allow the retrofitting of existing associations. Not to mention impact and costs for new infrastructure, costs of metering, the cost benefit to the association, non-budgeted reserve expense. If we're bringing common charging stations that are going to be association-based costs, the association to do that would have to bear the cost of all the engineers, the cost of plans and permitting, trenching, billing of users. To Adam's point, there's technology out there now. You can drive up to a station, and I think that's not going to be an issue if we have associations that do eventually put in these common area stations that are separately metered, because there's equipment and technologies out there that allow users to just pull out a credit card or have a predetermined app and fire away. And I think if you're smart enough to be driving a Tesla, you're probably smart enough to have an app because it's part of the process. So your phone is your ignition key. So the app's already there. Future strains on associations. What is this going to do if there's mandatory expansion of this program to existing associations? It's pretty scary if you think about it. They're all on budget items. There isn't one reserve study that I've done in the last 15 years that has anything to do about a future charging station for electric vehicles. So everyone's useful life study would have to be redone because these costs have to be built into that. And those capital expenditures have to be reallocated accordingly. Because if this does fall on the auspices of the association and the association is responsible to retrofit these newly qualified associations that are mandated to do this because we're going carbonless, how does that impact it? So that's another cost because now we got to redo the reserve study. Not to mention the continuous maintenance costs of these common area charging stations, which all leads to increased assessments. Insurance, when we talked about insurance, the added liability of insurance. What do these stations do? If it's a common area station, the association put it in. What is the policy going to look like? What are the risks to that particular component that's inside a garage or outside a garage? What's the liability? What's the potential property damage? And how is it going to impact insurance rates? That these are all factors involved. From our standpoint, this is easy. Because as a management company, we're going to mandate that our client talks to the attorney. I'm not going to pretend that I can author a rule and regulation or a policy that's going to fit the letter of the law. I want my legal minds behind this 100%. I want them to work as a team with the management company, with the board of directors, do a Zoom meeting, figure out what you want, how you want it, and then it's got to fit the letter of the law, period. That's first and foremost. And then secondly, the ACC guidelines, they're already set in stone. You already have to do this anyway. If you were going to modify, some people, if you're going to put cameras on the side of your building, you've got to go through an ACC form. You've got to give us the number of cameras, the location of the cameras, the method of application, whether you're going to penetrate siding, whether it's going to be attached to brick, whatever. So as far as our policies and procedures for submitting a request for an electric charging station, that's going to be the same. That's no different than in asking for new windows. But the key is to this whole process is safety, proper installation, design and permit, qualified installer, municipality review and approval. Jim, you alluded to, maybe it was Chris too, when we talked about how do we evaluate costs with doing that crazy formula for averaging. And I'm like, how does an association even begin to audit that? How do we even get the information to begin to assess a dollar amount to a homeowner for usage? That to me seems pretty difficult. If you're going to go along those lines, you got to get a system where it's independent of any audit from the association's perspective, whether they've got to go in on their own account and pay for it and reserve the time, reserve the space, and that's the only time they can do it. Almost pre-buy it, where they have to be there at 9 o'clock, they're done at 10. Next person's done in at 10 and done at 11, sort of thing. And there are programs and schedules out there for that. But that was an interesting component that actually made it into law on how they would calculate that. So from a property management's perspective, I'm just thankful that this doesn't apply to existing associations just yet. But we know it's coming. I would assume it's coming. The newer associations that are being built, those are easy retrofits, and that's just going to be cost of construction. That's going to be built into your purchase price. A couple issues that we're facing right now, and Adam alluded to it, and so did Marshall, was individual garages that are on common electric that have plugs. And we've got a couple Teslas that are plugged in, and we're seeing increased costs on our common electric bill and dealing with those issues. And that's forcing us to get the attorney involved, because they're drawing up costs that are common electrical costs that we weren't anticipating. So we have a smaller association in Glen Ellen. They have 3 Teslas, and those Teslas are plugged in all the time on 110, and they have to be, because there's no other source on this property. So that's an issue that our client is dealing with, and we're using the resource of the attorney to deal with that as well, because we're getting brushed back, because these garages by design are all individual garages all in a row. And so we can't gain access, but we know where they're at. And we know that the metering of those increased costs are a result of these Teslas being charged overnight, continuously, day after day after day. So from my perspective, and from the association's perspective, I think most associations probably already have a pretty strong ACC requirement submission for any kind of modification to their home. And since we're dealing with electrical, the review is more stringent from a municipality standpoint, and then the planning from an engineering standpoint is even more stringent. So the barriers to entry, I think, are sort of inherent.
Jory, I have a question for you from a management perspective. A lot of things you said, one of the things that occurred to me is, wow, there's going to be a lot there. How do you see that impacting administratively and additional work on management?
Yeah, I mean, we have, unfortunately, sometimes we have to be reactive. And we have to roll up our sleeves and put the time in to make sure that we guide them the right way. And it's going to require, obviously, more consult with legal. And in fact, as you know, as a result of this new law, you guys are kind of rolling up your sleeves already and devising rules and regulations and policies and procedures that are probably somewhat boilerplate for the most part. That's sort of all encompassing, and then you would kind of modify it to fit the specifics of your association based on what's written in your declarations and bylaws and existing rules and regulations. Yeah, it's going to take more of our time, but it's something that's I think it's very important that we work as a partnership with the correct parties to make this right.
Even when it's implemented, and say there's liability insurance requirements, someone's got to keep track of the policy, make sure you get the renewals.
Mm-hmm.
If you're trying to do that formula to calculate the cost of electricity, someone's got to do that. Someone's got to charge the account for it. Someone's got to collect it. I mean, that's going to fall on management down the road.
1000% it'll fall on us, and even dealing with, if we do get to a point where we're putting in common area charging stations, as you know, law firms that were involved in closings, the amount of information that is embedded now in a sale, how much more in-depth questioning goes into your typical condo questionnaire. I mean, the condo questionnaire has really exploded in volume, and this is going to be part of that as well. And the underwriters on the insurance side, as this becomes more commonplace in associations, they're also going to look at that risk. They're going to have to look at that risk, right? Anytime that you put something in that can cause danger or peril to human life, property, that's a component of risk that has to be analyzed and equated into policy premium. And that's going to impact, the one bottom line thing here is budget. How's this going to affect the budget? We're dealing with inflationary costs across the board. Every service provider out there is increasing costs because of labor and materials. How is this going to impact it? Significantly, I would assume. So I get nervous about if there's a big change in law, how you look at your reserve study and you've got a potential roofing project, a siding project, a parking lot project, an asphalt project, a sidewalk project, et cetera. And all of a sudden now you got to put in $100,000 charging station because you got to put in 4 of them in 4 different areas. I just did an electrical trenching just to make a repair, a simple lighting repair. It was $27,000 just to trench new wiring because the association was built in the late 70s, no conduit, old wiring in ground, not in conduit, severed. I can't believe it lasted this long, but we found the breach. We had to dig up three lines, do a Julie locate and trench. And it was a $27,000 project. If you were to take the same association and go from a power source or bring in a power source and put in 2 or 3 power stations, charging stations, what's that going to cost? It's only a 100-unit complex. And what's the percentage? Another thing that, it's interesting, but what's the percentage of electric vehicle users relative to, gas and diesel? And how quickly is that going to turn around? I was in New York I was in New York 2 months ago. And I know we talk about carbonless, decarbonizing our country, but I'm sitting there in New York and I'm having lunch and I'm just looking at the volume and the density of, my son lives in Tribeca. And I'm sitting there and I'm thinking, how do you take a 75-story building that's got 15 units on every floor that is gas powered, gas heated, and just convert it to electric? And then all these vehicles that are driving up and down in New York, and all of a sudden, how do you change the power grid? How do you upgrade the power grid? For Adam to do his job, he can't do his job until the power grid changes. This guy could be the greatest guy in the world. He could be the smartest guy in the world. His company could do anything and everything. But without the power coming to the source where he needs it, we might as well play cards all day until that comes to where we need it, because we can't do anything. So there's a lot of the infrastructure is mind-boggling. So I'm praying that we don't have anything that all of a sudden there's a magic wand and Pritzker says, yeah, okay, now every association over 50 units has to have four charging stations. It's sort of scary.
This is what we have to sort of prepare for the future. And one thing that lately has come out is the governor, along with the IEPA, has a rebate program for electric charging vehicles for the incentive to buy an electric charging vehicle. And there's a $4,000 rebate. Also, some of the electric charging vehicle makers like Tesla has offered 50% off of the price to purchase the car. What I'm hoping is that the good governor is going to look at the associations that are going to incur this expense if we are, as we're marching toward regulation of the association to actually be forced to put these charging stations in the future, if there will be any rebates for the association. And when we were down at Springfield, ILAC, I asked one of the sponsors of the bill, do you plan to help the associations fund these expenses? Because again, you're going to be putting more into your budget. The reserve study will call for it. Everything has to be revamped. What are you going to do for the association that does want to be proactive, that does want to get into the decarbonization and actually provide the service for their residents? What are you going to provide for us? So hopefully, as there are grants now for the people who are purchasing these vehicles, maybe there'll be in the future grants for the associations, because again, as Jory touched on, the expense for the association to retrofit that parking lot, okay, and incur those expenses, what does that mean? Does that mean rise in assessments? Does that mean special assessments? So, and how many people are going to benefit from those improvements? Someone might say, well, I don't drive an electric car, so why should I pay for the parking lot and the electricity that's going to be output for someone else? And again, it's the right of enjoyment. If that person doesn't enjoy those amenities, well, is it fair for the association to go ahead, or will we be forced to? So these are some of the thoughts that we need to sort of think about and plan for. And I think it's always better if we're prepared in advance than just have to hustle and make all these accommodations. I think, Mary Ellen, at this time, what we should, Jory, are you finished?
Can I just have one more,
Sure.
have one more thing to
Okay.
add, if you don't mind, real quick. And that is that, as much as there's these rebates and refunds and everybody gets, you buy a car, you get 4,000 back, you put in a station, Adam's bill's 50,000, but there's a grant, and Illinois pays 25,000, and then the association pays the other 25. The last I saw, Illinois it's a taxing body, right? They're not making sandwiches and selling sandwiches and taking the profits from their sandwiches and giving rebates to people. The consumer and every business that's out there is funding these rebates, or through federal grants, which once again, the federal government's not making. They don't have a sandwich shop. They're not selling sandwiches. They're not in a thriving business. It's all tax-based revenue. So if they're going to give more away to decarbonize the country, and they're using money to do it, the money's coming from us. It's coming from me. It's coming from you. It's coming from every business out there. And so we're going to pay for it either way.
Very true.
That's-
Has there been any crossover? One of the questions that's out there that Marshall is taking aim at there on the Q&A has to do with crossover between solar panels and EV charging. Has anybody come across any of that information?
I was just writing a response. Adam would probably agree with me. I hope he would. Solar panels are just not adequate to power the kinds of power that we would need for most level 2 charging stations. It may be good enough for one level 1 station, but it certainly isn't good enough for a level 2 station, period.
Yeah, and it's also gonna, how much the solar panels could offset the electric vehicle generation is gonna depend, right? It depends on the facility. How big is the roof? How big of a solar farm can you put in? If you have a very horizontal building with a lot of roof surface that you want to put solar panels on, and you only need 6 EV chargers, it might be able to do it, especially if you combine it with a large battery pack on the facility where you basically charge the electric vehicle from the battery pack and the solar panels feed into that battery. So, you know, that's similar to is already happening and will continue to happen out there in the grid. Electrical grid is to balance the grid using batteries. It's happening in Australia quite a lot with sustainable sources. In fact, I just saw something where their electric bills are so getting really, really low now. They used to be extremely high. So yeah, it depends, but yeah, are you going to develop enough solar power to offset all that? Likely not in a lot of facilities here in Chicago, but you know, we do have clients that are putting them in and we're designing it because in some cases it does make good financial sense for them.
Mary Ellen, would you like to continue with the rest of the questions now that haven't been answered? And we'll take the next 20 minutes on that before we wrap up.
Yeah, I think most everything I had some that were submitted ahead of time. I'm just going to look through those, but the question, one of them that was about federal and state infrastructure incentives was addressed already. And
I think I saw a question about will associations need to update their insurance? And my first response, even to my clients, is I direct you to talk to your insurance professional about insurance matters. But it depends what insurance, what type of insurance you're talking about, the type of association. And Jory already covered some of this now in when he spoke. If you're a condo association, your property policy by law is already 100% replacement. So there's really nothing to update there. Although, interesting question of whether there's some exclusions that might apply to charging stations. If you're not a condo, it depends on if your association insures the buildings or not. And you may or may not have 100% coverage. So you'd want to look into that. If you talk about liability insurance, again, my first thought is, are there exclusions that could apply or might apply, or depending on, say, a fire and type of fire? Good questions to address to your insurance people. And as Jory said, no matter what, it's the adjusters and the underwriters are really going to be dealing with this. And it's likely everyone's insurance, once these things start happening, it's going to start affecting your bottom line and increasing your insurance rates at the very least on liability side, but also on the property side. If people think, the underwriters think there's a real threat of fires, you know, electrical fires.
there's a related question that came in to me before session that had to do with not only electric vehicles, but electric transportation modes in general. With these kinds of things like electric bicycles, other kinds of electric modes of moving people, we require separate kinds of policies and separate kinds of contributions to the rules and regulations, or are these things that can be rolled into modes of transportation policy? Are these handled separately for other kinds of things, bicycles and other things that charge up but are not reliable in terms of battery stability?
Well, I mean, I think I can answer that from an association perspective. It depends on the design of the association, type of the association. But to your point, envision a condominium association with a common hallway where there's bike storage, and there's a 110 outlet, and I've got an electric bike. And once again, I'm plugging into that system. And maybe there might be 3 of those in that hallway. And then 2 doors over, there's 3 more of those bikes, and 4 doors over there's 4 more bikes. And now I haven't run into that, but that's an interesting question. But absolutely, it impacts the association, and it impacts our operating budget, and it also impacts the risk of overload. I just had an association, and Adam could probably, we had an association that had stay block breakers in it, and stay block circuit breakers across the board were mandated to cause major fires. And so our insurance carrier, for us to continue insurance, mandated that we have all 60 unit owners, and we do all our common from stay block to a more modernized circuit breaker system, because those systems failed. And we had a mandate they do that. There was a risk of fire because of the overload. They're not working the way they're designed. And interestingly, they were mandated to make that change. But if you were to impose even more loads with these electric bikes, that would increase the risk of fire. So it's interesting. I fortunately haven't gotten to that point, but I guarantee our underwriters they're getting more savvy. They're the questions that are coming after an inspection and the mandates that they're making are definitely more intense.
Yeah, thank you.
I'm just guessing. Can I add to that? I'm just guessing.
Sure, go ahead.
Adam, the fires in the electric vehicles, the companies are so highly regulated by governmental agencies that they're all over that, and they're trying to do everything they can to deal with that. But now you've got little companies in China that are making electric bikes with lithium-ion batteries. The batteries may be independently approved and meet UL requirements or other requirements, but that doesn't mean that they don't explode and catch fire. Just like, if you remember a few years ago, that was a constant in these little platforms that the kids ride around on, the electric platforms. They were catching fire left and right. So I think that's an interesting concern. I never even got to that stage with Jory, and you really triggered me on it. And then the people are going to just take an extension cord and plug in 3 bicycles in the same 20 amp outlet, and you're going to overload that 20 amp outlet without any question. And if you have 3 or so of those places around, you're going to have all kinds of problems, potential for fire, and a potential fire that you can't even stop until the battery's gone. So it could take the whole building out, very frankly, and or you're overloading the circuitry in the various areas. And people don't think about it. They just go buy an extension cord or a multi-connector that they plug into the outlet and plug everything in the world in there. I guess the best example is I walked into my barbershop once, and the beautician had about 14 things plugged into a bunch of outlets there. And I said, if an inspector comes in and sees that, they're going to close you. You can't do that. And she said, why? I said, do you know how much current you're drawing? She said, I only use one at a time, was her answer. And I just looked at her like, come on, you know better than that. And she started laughing, very frankly. And she actually removed all the plugs, removed the extension. And the next time I was in, I came in and she said, you see, I listened to your advice. You told me it was dangerous, and I'm only plugging in one at a time when I have to use it, because they don't need to be sitting there plugged in. And I didn't think about it till you said it. So, could you pass a rule, put it on a big placard and put it in that room? Sure, you ought to do that. right away. But that you phrase some things that really kind of blow my mind for a guy that was kind of reluctant to be in this part of the program. You've done an outstanding job, Jory, and I'm just
Thanks, Marshall. Likewise.
thanks. And it's you triggered me on a couple of things, and we've talked. You did a good job here, and that's an interesting problem. I think it's a really interesting problem.
Well,
And
there's another related question about that, Marshall, even. The whole concept of right to charge came up as a conversation about the various states moving in the direction of right to charge legislation. And I wanted to know if that was in the same vein as the previous discussion and conversation we had about that basically we're expect these things to happen to existing associations. Is that the gist, right to charge, that this is going to move forward to include all associations, or is there something different about that?
sure,
Can I address
Chris.
it
Yes.
real quick, Marshall, and you can, because that term right to charge, I mean, section 30 of the Electric Vehicle Charging Act, that is essentially what people kind of refer to with right to charge. And it is real. And, Marshall indicated earlier, and so did Jim, like, expect this stuff to come down, start applying to existing buildings really soon. And for example, in the Chicago, there's been an ordinance or proposed ordinance introduced last year that's called the Electric Vehicle Right to Charge Ordinance. And it looks very similar to an old version of Section 30 that's in the current Electric Vehicle Charging Act. So we're definitely going to see that, and it's already out there. And that right to charge language is being used in ways to allow people to make sure they can install EV charging stations.
But there is
I had,
there is actually a statute in place that says if you're resupplying electric power to another user, you cannot charge more than you're charged for that power. For all practical purposes, it's to prevent unreasonable extra charges being tacked on by you as a resupplier. So the concern, if that's part of the concern, there's already a statute in effect in the state of Illinois that limits your ability to add on extra costs. The only problem that we run into in this, Adam's shaking his head yes. So
Yeah, we've looked into that before, and we've made it very clear to clients that they can't take
Right.
the electricity from ComEd and upcharge it and send it, and charge an individual for it.
they can only pass on the charges. The problem is if they've got to figure it out by subdividing and doing things like that, there's the argument that you're unreasonably subdividing the amounts. And that's where you're going to run into a problem. And that's why the best way to handle it is make them put in a sub-meter. Period.
on the following up on what Chris said, I'm right to charge. I had an interesting question about 9 months ago. A client with an indoor garage asked me for an opinion whether they could pass a rule prohibiting the parking of electric vehicles in their indoor garage. Not the charging station, not charging, but just parking in the garage because of fear of fires. And it came up because someone was very good friends with the fire chief of this municipality who told them when there's a fire, there's nothing they can do to put it out. So I did some research and internet research, and I found one article of one association in Colorado who did that. And that's only because they had had a fire. But to the point, I think Chris, Mariel, and Diane was even referring to this, is a lot of municipalities, I think New York City is one of them, is moving in the direction of right to charge. And prohibiting restrictions and barring prohibitions on right to charge. I mean, everyone's going in that direction. It'll be interesting to see if Jory's concerns about extreme, the higher costs and administrative nightmares and infrastructure throws roadblocks, but it's coming.
Just the actual fire element here is what I think is frightening me. 2 doors down from me. And I think that that's something that we definitely have to delve into as an association. Mary Ellen, are we at the end of our questions, or are there any subject-specific questions that we want to deal with?
Yeah, the only other things that were left out in terms of just questions that I've received. One had to do with even if an association has an intent to install, inquiries about installation from owners, are there any requirements in terms of how to respond to owners when perhaps none of the infrastructure is in place in an organization, or perhaps none of the policy is in place in an organization? So is there anything that is guiding associations in the absence of this kind of, and the void, I would have to call it, really?
I can address that. I mean, theoretically there isn't a void. If someone wants to install, there's still the process. But like I mentioned earlier, the key phrase is barriers to entry. What are the barriers to entry? They still have to go through an ACC process as if they would with any other modification. And in that process, they have to do all the things that Adam pretty much laid out in his presentation with, what is the draw? What is going to be? Where's the service going to be? What's the logistics of all of this? Can we create the load? What do we have to do to bring this power to the location that this person's requesting? And it's all at their cost, because once again, it's not association generated, it's individual generated. So what we tell them is, here's the steps you have to go through. Now go do your due diligence on your own. And they're soon going to find that it's cheaper to drive 6 miles and just go to a charging station and sit there for 2 hours and go have coffee somewhere, as opposed to spending $20,000, $25,000, $30,000 to get their charging station. My son drives a Tesla. He lives in Beverly Shores, Indiana. He wants to do it. His circuit breaker's it's in the basement. His basement ceiling's about 5 or 6 feet high. Everything's above that. He's got to bore through and bring this out to his garage. The charging station alone isn't expensive. It's all the infrastructure work that he's got to do to bring that service to. So, he's on hold right now because of it. But at the end of the day, when you tell them what steps they have to go through, and these are the steps you got to go through. Now contact the guy like Adam and say, hey, Adam, this is Mary. I want to do this. Can you help me? And Adam comes out and goes, yeah, this is what you have to do. And here's a manual of the basic costs. And it's sticker shock.
Well, that's where the professionals that work with the board will assist. And again, the engineering, the legal, and the manager who's going to direct the board. I think at this time, if there's any other questions, I'm sure the participants would be willing to answer. You can also contact Jamie, and then she will give you their contact information. At this point, we thank you, Jory. We thank you, Marshall. We thank you, Adam, Jim, and Chris, for all your wise guidance as we move through the next phase of preparing and initiating the charging stations. Mary Ellen, thank you for your counseling and your consolidating the questions. That really helped us a lot. And Jamie, it's all yours.
I just wanted to let everyone know that everybody who's presented today, their contact information is in the chat box right now. If you'd like to save that. This webinar will be recorded and posted to our YouTube channel within 1 week from today. And the materials that were presented on today will be made available to everyone tomorrow. I am going to just put up a quick poll. You should see it pop up on your screen. If you could just rate this session from 1 to 5, 5 being the best before you leave. This is a great way for us to gauge just right off the bat the effectiveness of these presentations. There will be also a full-length feedback survey about each of our presenters and the topics today and future topics you're interested in learning about. That will be sent out to everyone who participated today. That will be sent tomorrow. So please keep a lookout for that. Please answer those surveys. We do directly use the survey results to plan these sessions. As Diane said, I would love to thank our volunteers who spent their evening presenting today. It's clear that there's a lot of questions and information to learn about this topic. So this may not be the first or the last time that we cover this topic in a learning session. In any case, thank you so much to everyone. Thank you to everybody who hung out for this whole 3 hours. Hopefully your questions were answered. If not, I'm sure any one of our presenters would be glad to answer further questions if you reach out to them at the contact information provided. And of course, CAI Illinois is always here to answer any of your questions or connect you with any professionals you feel can help you in situations like these. Otherwise, have a wonderful evening. We hope to see you at our next educational event. Thank you, everyone, for participating.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Have a great night.
Very much.
Thank
Thank you,
you.
guys. Thank you.